The Nikon Z6 III is the most powerful camera at this price, and better than anything from the competition. Despite that, most reviews are negative, but those shooting with it love it. So what are the reviews missing? Well, the Z6 III has been my main camera for the last 6 months, and the truth about this camera is not what people tell you. So let me show you why this is a game-changing camera and if it's right for you. Also, quick housekeeping, Nikon did not sponsor this video or have anything to do with it. I simply love this camera and wanted to be part of the community by sharing my experience. But if you want to check out this camera, I'll leave links down below. Now, let's start off with the most controversial part of this camera and why it's getting so much hate, the sensor. The Z6 III has a 24 megapixel full frame partially stacked sensor, which does have some benefits and some downsides. As a benefit, it minimizes rolling shutter, so you can use this for fashion, sports, wildlife, or any kind of fast-moving action. And the Z6 III is the only mid-range camera that can do this. Most cameras with this performance actually charge you double the price. But there's also a drawback to the sensor. It does have lower dynamic range, so the Z6 III sees less information in a scene. But the question is, does it actually matter to you in the real world? Well, the answer is really different depending on if you're shooting photos or video. When shooting photos, it's actually really easy to bring back highlights and even some very deep shadows without an issue, and any noise can easily be cleaned up. The only sticking point with this camera is that you have to shoot at a minimum of 800 ISO, which is pretty standard. And actually editing the photos from this camera, there's more than enough flexibility to create stunning edits. And I personally love the results I had with this camera when you look at the before and after results. But video is a whole different story, and video is also why I got this camera. The Z6 III has 10.5 stops of dynamic range versus the 12.5 stops that's pretty standard in most cameras. In bright outdoor and studio lighting, no matter how uneven the lighting is, there's more than enough dynamic range and information to capture the scene, and it's really easy to fix and balance your image in post-processing. And you also have 4 new film looks developed by Red Cinema cameras for Nikon. Yes, the $80,000 Hollywood cinema camera company helped come up with these conversions. So the color grading is easier than ever because you have multiple starting points. It's basically like having 4 different film looks built right into your camera. And holy cow, I love the colors from this camera and Nikon cameras in general. They're super accurate with super high fidelity. When it comes to color grading, it's a really easy time with the Nikon cameras, but dynamic range for video does become an issue in low light or dim lighting conditions. You really have to protect your shadows and nail your exposure because your shadows will clip much more easily because of that reduced dynamic range and become very noisy. But the Nikon Z6 III does have a dual native ISO of 800 and 6400. It easily brings up more information in the shadows without introducing a ton of noise. And in my experience, there's also no flickering issues at high ISO. Some people have said there's a flickering issue, but I have not seen it on my camera. But when shooting in low light, I wouldn't just rely on ISO. Instead, I would recommend shooting with faster lenses. Most Nikon lenses easily go up to 1.4 or 1.8, so you have plenty of low light lenses available for this camera system. But if you're going to be doing video, I instead recommend investing in cinema glass. I've mainly been using this camera with the Nisi Athena lenses. They're small, compact, and they actually open up to f1.9 without losing sharpness and detail, and because they're so small, they pair really well with the Nikon Z6 III. And these lenses are only about $1,000, which is the same price as Nikon glass. So ultimately, this whole dynamic range conversation is overblown clickbait. And when you're actually using this camera in the real world, you're going to get great results if you use this camera in the right way. So then why do people who actually use this camera absolutely love it, and how is the Z6 III better than the competition? But one thing to note, this camera isn't perfect and it still has some actual flaws in it, and there's 2 things that might be complete deal breakers for some of you. So the first reason I love the Z6 III and why it's better than the competition is how fast it can shoot photos. It shoots 14 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode and a ridiculous 20 frames per second electronic shutter mode with 60 frames per second in JPEG and 120 frames per second with a crop, but also in JPEG. And it maintains 14-bit RAW across all RAW modes, where Canon and Sony actually lower the quality of the RAW mode to 12-bit RAW instead of 14-bit RAW, when shooting in continuous mode. This gives you faster shooting speed without rolling shutter artifacts because of that partially stacked sensor, and better raw files in continuous shooting, while costing basically the same as the competition, the A7 IV and the R6 Mark II. So in a lot of ways, the Nikon Z6 III wins hands down. But before you decide, we still have to look at those two major flaws I mentioned earlier. Now, the main selling point of the Z6 III for me is video, and this camera straight up does better resolutions, better frame rates with better video codec than any other video camera at this price point, and even some cameras that cost twice as much. And if I told you about every single video feature, we would be here all day. So here are the ones worth knowing about. The Z6 III has 6K and 4K 12-bit Nikon RAW at 24, 30, and 60 frames per second with no crop, no compromise, and the RAW is all internal, means you do not need any sort of accessories. Plus, it also has 4K at 120 frames per second with a 1.6 times crop. The quality will be lower because you're throwing away about half your sensor, but it's a really cool feature to have. Now, one major criticism that people have about the RAW in this camera is that it's very noisy, and that is simply not true. With good exposure and proper lighting, there's actually no noise. It's only if your image is too dark. And it's also just chroma noise, which is the random color speckles. And this takes about 3 seconds to fix, so it's really not that big of an issue. Now, one thing that might be an issue for some of you is that the Nikon RAW only works in DaVinci Resolve. If you don't have DaVinci Resolve, you don't want to learn a new editing program, this might be an issue. But there is an answer for Premiere Pro users. You also have ProRes RAW. However, this has different frame rates. 6K up to 30 frames per second. Sadly, there is no 60 frames per second, but you can shoot 4K up to 60 frames per second with no crop or compromise, so you basically get the same quality as Nikon RAW, but in Apple ProRes. Now, if you don't want to do RAW video, but you still want high quality video, you also have Apple ProRes 422 HQ at 5K up to 30 frames per second, and 4K at 60 frames per second, but with a slight crop, and Full HD up to 120 frames per second with no crop, but Full HD with 60 frames per second with a crop, which is kind of weird. Now, this is probably a good time to talk about the first deal breaker in the Nikon Z6 III, and that is actually the RAW video. When you're shooting with RAW, you guys will be shocked at how much data this camera takes up. When shooting 6K at 60 frames per second on a 256GB card, I'm only getting 17 minutes on high and 35 minutes on normal. And at 6K at 24 frames per second, I'm getting an hour and 27 minutes on normal and 44 minutes on high RAW. No matter how you slice it, you're probably going to shoot 500 to 1,000 gigabytes a day on a professional shoot. And unfortunately, the other formats take up just as much space. And if you want to edit RAW video smoothly, you're gonna need a good computer. I have a brand new Apple MacBook M3 and it runs without a problem, but that is a $6,000 Canadian computer. That's double the price of the Z6 III. So if you want to buy this camera, just be prepared to drop a bag on the hard drives and the computer. And this is something a lot of you guys may not know before picking up this camera, but I do have a solution. If you're just starting out and RAW is something more of an aspirational feature in this camera that you want to use every now and then, but most of your work does not need RAW, there's also the Nikon H.265 mode that's 10-bit at 420 color, at 5K up to 60 frames per second with no crop, and 4K at 60 and 4K at 120 with a crop, but Full HD in 240 with a very small minimal 5% crop. But the H.265 does have some pretty aggressive noise reduction, so it's not the right format for pixel peeping, but it will more than get the job done for simple things like corporate videos or YouTube videos. I actually shot 2 separate YouTube videos in H.265 and the video looked totally fine. But you have the ability to get high quality video for any kind of workflow, and this is a huge win for this camera because most cameras lock you into one workflow, and if that doesn't fit your workflow, then the camera's not for you. Now, let's talk about the second deal breaker in the Z6 III, and that is the autofocus. The autofocus isn't bad, it's just not great when you compare it to Canon or Sony. For simple stuff like a quick portrait or a YouTube video, it's actually more than enough. In both of my YouTube videos, I only had about 2 autofocusing issues, and that's because I was maintaining about the same distance from the camera at all times. The Z6 III only really struggles if you come really close to the camera then really far away. It's that in and out tracking that it doesn't do a great job at. And when you compare it to Canon or Sony, it's just not as reliable. but the Z6 III is as good as the Lumix autofocus or the Fuji autofocus. However, for me, as mainly a video shooter, this autofocus does not bother me at all. Because if you're shooting raw video or ProRes, chances are you're also using cinema lenses that are manual focus. I shot all of the video in studio with the Nisi Athenas and the DJI LiDAR autofocus, and I personally love that setup. And as a side note, you can also use the Sony E-mount lenses with the Nikon Z6 III with an adapter. The autofocus won't be as good as native, and there are some stabilization issues, but imagine if you could put Sony lenses on a Canon RF body. That would be huge, which is why I'm really excited because I own a ton of Sony gear, and it's nice to know that even if the autofocus isn't perfect, I can still use my lenses with my Nikon body. And a lot of us have been waiting for Sony to get internal RAW, so until they get that figured out, getting a Nikon body just for the raw video is a really good stopgap because you can still use the same lenses. Now the body and ergonomics on this camera are pretty typical, but there's some really exciting stuff in this camera that I do not think it gets the credit for. One of the things that I love is that it does have a side articulating screen with touch autofocus and touch controls, but this screen on the back is crazy bright as well as the viewfinder. The screen on the side is actually as bright as an iPhone screen, and the viewfinder is actually 4000 nits. But this camera also has built-in waveforms for anyone that really wants to nail their focus without needing an external monitor. Now, the only con in terms of body and design that I have for this camera is that there's no scroll wheel on the back, it's just a 4-way touchpad, and to change ISO you first have to hit the ISO button on the top and then change it with using this dial on the back, but it's not that big of a deal. I do, however, love the fact that the audio jack can both take an external mic or a line from an external audio recorder or an audio interface, so this would actually be a pretty good podcast or sit-down YouTube talking head camera like this, because you could use a really high quality XLR mic through an audio interface with it. And the Z6 III has no overheating. I've been shooting all day with it. I had zero issues. And because the battery size in this camera is pretty large, you can pretty much get through an entire day of shooting with 2 batteries. And the Z6 III also has a single CF Express Type B card slot and a single SD card slot. Most people would have liked to see dual SD card or dual CF Express Type card record slots in this. However, you wouldn't have enough room for it, and also CF Express Type B is an ultra reliable card type that you don't often see fail, so probably wouldn't need it. In my opinion, the Z6 III really has no design flaws. It's a phenomenal hybrid camera. In terms of value for power, there's really nothing else like this on the market. And if you're someone that wants raw video or ProRes and you were thinking of a Lumix S5 IIX or a Blackmagic camera, this is going to give you better frame rates for about the same amount of money. And in my opinion, I would rather have this, although the Blackmagic Pixis does have a better design for higher end workflow. However, if you're not doing high-end video and you're making simpler stuff like YouTube videos or corporate and you want to shoot slower subject matter, I think you should get a Sony or a Canon instead, because you will have better dynamic range, better autofocus, and better stabilization. And I think the Z6 III is really for someone that wants to do high-end video without paying a whole lot of money. Ultimately, I do not care what camera you buy. I want to share my experience because I really like this camera. If you want to learn more about it, I'll leave the links down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.